Canada is making a move that could quietly reshape the North American battery supply chain. And this time, the story isn't simply about another lithium project, another graphite mine, or another battery factory. It is about who Canada chooses to work with as critical minerals become one of the most strategically important resources in the world. For decades, the United States has been Canada's overwhelmingly dominant economic partner. Canadian resources have flowed south, American manufacturers have depended on Canadian inputs, and the two countries have built one of the most deeply integrated industrial relationships on the planet. But that relationship is changing. Canada is now actively building stronger mineral and battery partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Europe, and other allies, and Japan may be one of the most important partners of all. In June 2026, Reuters reported that Canada and Japan were discussing deeper cooperation on critical minerals, including joint stockpiling, mining projects, and long-term offtake agreements. The discussions involve minerals such as graphite and gallium, materials that are increasingly important to batteries, electronics, defense systems, and advanced manufacturing. Canada's trade minister described Japan as an important avenue for doing more together on critical minerals, and one of the clearest examples is already taking shape in Quebec. Nouveau Monde Graphite is developing its Matawini graphite mine and associated processing operations. The project has attracted support from Canada, Japan, and Panasonic. Canada's Major Projects Office says the project includes offtake arrangements involving the Canadian government and Panasonic, along with an investment commitment from Japan. In March 2026, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and Export Development Canada also executed a $459 million loan agreement supporting the next stage of the project. So this is not simply a story about Canada selling raw graphite to Japan. It is about building a new supply chain, Canadian resources, Canadian processing, Japanese investment, Japanese battery expertise, and potentially North American battery manufacturing. That distinction is extremely important, because the headline may suggest that Canada has simply turned its back on America. The evidence doesn't support that. Canada has not announced that it is abandoning the United States. In fact, many Canadian critical mineral projects are specifically designed to strengthen North American supply chains. But Canada is doing something that could nevertheless make Washington uncomfortable. It is creating alternatives, and alternatives create leverage. Let's go back to where this relationship with Japan began. In September 2023, Japan and Canada signed a comprehensive memorandum of cooperation covering battery supply chains from upstream resources all the way through downstream manufacturing. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry described Canada as the first country with which Japan had signed this type of battery supply chain memorandum. The agreement was designed to encourage Japanese investment in Canada and create sustainable and reliable battery supply chains between the two countries. And the cooperation wasn't theoretical. At the same time, Panasonic Energy and Nouveau Monde Graphite signed an agreement concerning technology for producing anode active material from graphite. Another Japanese-linked agreement involved nickel resources in Canada. The message was already clear. Japan wanted secure access to Canadian resources. Canada wanted Japanese investment in technology. And both countries wanted to build supply chains that were more resilient to geopolitical disruption. 3 years later, that strategy looks even more significant. Why? Because critical minerals have become a geopolitical battleground. For years, companies could largely treat minerals as commodities, buy them where they were cheapest, process them wherever capacity existed, ship them to factories. But that model is under pressure. Governments are increasingly asking a different question. What happens if the cheapest supplier becomes politically unreliable? What happens if a major producer imposes export restrictions? What happens if a war disrupts shipping? What happens if tariffs suddenly make a supply chain uneconomic? And what happens if one country controls a huge share of global processing capacity? Those aren't theoretical questions anymore. Japan is experiencing this problem directly. China has imposed restrictions affecting Japanese access to several strategically important rare earth materials. Reuters reported in July 2026 that Chinese exports of gallium, dysprosium, terbium, and yttrium to Japan remained at zero in June. Japan has one of the world's largest advanced manufacturing sectors, including a huge rare earth magnet industry, but it remains dependent on China for some critical inputs. That dependence has become a strategic vulnerability, and this explains why Canada is becoming increasingly attractive. Canada has the geology, Japan has the industrial demand. Canada wants investment, Japan wants secure supply. It is a natural match, and graphite may be the perfect example. Graphite is a critical component in conventional lithium-ion battery anodes. Without reliable graphite supplies, battery manufacturing becomes vulnerable, and China has historically dominated much of the world's graphite processing. So when Canada develops a major graphite project with Japanese participation, the significance goes far beyond one mine. It potentially creates another supply route. That is why the Nouveau Monde project matters, and it is why Panasonic's involvement matters. Panasonic is not simply a financial investor looking for a commodity. It is one of the world's major battery manufacturers. Its North American battery operations create a direct connection between Canadian raw materials and the broader North American electric vehicle industry. This means the emerging Canada-Japan relationship could actually support American factories even while giving Canada a broader international customer base. That sounds contradictory, but it isn't. This is how modern supply chains work. A Japanese company can invest in Canada, Canadian graphite can be processed in Canada, the material can enter a battery supply chain serving North America. And Canadian policymakers can still use that relationship to diversify their international economic partnerships. That is the real strategic shift. Canada doesn't have to choose between America and Japan. It can work with both, and it can work with South Korea and Europe as well. In March 2026, Canada announced a second round of critical mineral partnerships involving 12 allied partners. The Canadian government said the 30 new partnerships and investments could unlock $12.1 billion in critical mineral project capital. Among the projects was Frontier Lithium's lithium processing operation in Ontario. Frontier Lithium also signed a memorandum of understanding with Panasonic Energy for potential future lithium offtake. Again, the pattern appears: Canadian mineral production, Japanese battery companies, North American processing, and long-term supply agreements. This is not Canada abandoning the North American market. It is Canada trying to make North America part of a larger global network. And that is an important distinction. Canada's broader mineral strategy is becoming increasingly ambitious. In March, Ottawa announced more than $3.6 billion in new programs and investments aimed at developing Canada's critical mineral advantage. The government says Canada already has more than 200 operating mines producing more than 60 minerals and metals. But the goal is no longer simply to extract resources. The goal is to build an end-to-end value chain: mining, processing, refining, battery materials, manufacturing, recycling, and eventually finished products. That is where the real economic value lies. A country that exports raw ore captures only part of the value. A country that mines, refines, processes, manufactures, and recycles the same material can capture far more, and Canada is trying to move in that direction. Look at lithium. In April 2026, the Canadian government announced support for Mangrove Lithium in British Columbia. The company operates what Ottawa described as North America's first commercial electrochemical lithium refining facility. The facility is designed to produce battery-grade lithium at a scale equivalent to the needs of approximately 25,000 electric vehicles annually. Then look at cobalt. In May, Canada announced a $20 million investment in electrobattery materials to expand its refinery in Ontario. The project is designed to produce battery-grade cobalt sulfate. Again, the objective isn't simply to dig minerals out of the Canadian ground. It is to process them inside Canada, and then connect that processing capacity to customers. That brings us back to Japan. Japan needs secure materials. Canada wants secure customers. The relationship becomes mutually beneficial. But there's another country watching all of this very closely: the United States. Washington is also trying to rebuild its critical mineral supply chains, and the urgency has increased dramatically. On August 7, 2026, Reuters reported that the Trump administration announced around $3 billion in investments and commitments for critical mineral and battery projects. The initiatives include support for lithium-ion battery components, scandium production, and magnet manufacturing. The administration says the strategy is designed to strengthen U.S. defense supply chains and reduce dependence on foreign resources. Just one day earlier, Reuters reported that Washington was moving to restrict exports of tungsten scrap and battery waste, including black mass from lithium-ion batteries. The policy is intended to encourage more processing and recycling inside the United States. Think about what that means. Washington is trying to keep more strategic materials at home. Canada is trying to process more materials at home. Japan is trying to secure more overseas supply. South Korea is building strategic partnerships. And the G7 is trying to reduce dependence on China. The global mineral market is being reorganized. This isn't just an electric vehicle story anymore. Critical minerals are used in defense systems. They are used in semiconductors. They are used in magnets. They are used in energy storage. They are used in electronics. They are used in advanced manufacturing. So governments increasingly view these materials as national security assets, and that changes the way companies make decisions. A mining company no longer asks only, where can we sell this mineral for the highest price? It also asks, who is our customer? Can we sign a long-term contract? Will the customer still be there during a geopolitical crisis? Can the project receive government support? Can the material qualify under trade rules? Can we avoid tariffs? Can we secure financing? And can the entire supply chain operate without depending on one politically risky country? Those questions explain the rise of long-term offtake agreements. An offtake agreement essentially gives a producer a committed buyer that helps the mining company attract financing. and it gives the buyer greater confidence that future supplies will be available. The Nouveau Monde-Panasonic relationship is therefore much more important than a simple commodity purchase. It is part of the financial architecture of a new battery supply chain, and Ottawa is supporting that architecture. In 2025, Canada helped launch the Critical Minerals Production Alliance through the G7. The objective is to diversify and secure critical mineral production among trusted partners. The first round of projects included the Nouveau Monde Graphite project, with participation from Canada, Panasonic, and the Japanese government. Then in March 2026, Canada announced another 30 partnerships and investments. This is becoming a pattern. Canada is trying to turn its mineral resources into strategic relationships, and Japan is one of the countries most eager to participate. But there is a bigger question. Why would Canada want to diversify away from an economic relationship as valuable as the one with the United States? The answer is risk. Canada and the United States remain deeply integrated, but trade tensions have made policymakers more conscious of the danger of depending too heavily on one market. Tariffs can change investment calculations. A company deciding where to build a battery plant may look at today's tariff environment, but it also has to consider what trade policy might look like 5 or 10 years from now. That uncertainty can encourage diversification, and Canada has a huge incentive to create more buyers for its critical minerals. If there is only one major customer, that customer has tremendous bargaining power. If there are several customers, American, Japanese, Korean, European, the producer has more options. That doesn't mean Canada wants to replace the United States. It means Canada doesn't want the United States to be its only option. And that is a much more realistic interpretation of what is happening. The same logic applies to Japan. Japan doesn't want to replace every existing mineral supplier with Canada. It wants multiple sources, because Japan has learned what happens when geopolitical tensions threaten access to critical materials, and that pressure is becoming more intense. In June 2026, Canada and Japan discussed possible cooperation on joint stockpiling of critical minerals. Think about the significance of that. Governments don't stockpile ordinary commodities simply because they are interesting. They stockpile materials when they believe supply could be disrupted. Canada and Japan are effectively saying, we need enough critical materials on hand to survive a crisis. That is strategic planning, and it is part of a much larger global trend. At the June 2026 G7 summit, leaders agreed to establish a critical minerals alliance aimed at reducing dependence on China. The initiative involves coordination on stockpiling, investment, and diversification. The G7 is trying to ensure that no single non-G7 source becomes overwhelmingly dominant for strategic minerals. So Canada's partnership with Japan fits into a much larger geopolitical realignment. The United States is building domestic capacity, Japan is securing alternative international supplies. Canada is developing its own resources and processing. South Korea is deepening partnerships. Europe is seeking secure mineral sources. And China remains the dominant player in many critical mineral processing chains. The competition is no longer simply about who owns the mine, it is about who controls the entire chain. And this is where Canada has a potentially enormous advantage. Canada has access to resources, it has sophisticated financial institutions, it has established mining expertise. It has significant hydroelectric resources. It has Atlantic and Pacific ports. It is politically aligned with the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. And it already has an integrated manufacturing relationship with the United States. If Canada can combine all of those advantages, it could become one of the world's most important trusted suppliers of critical minerals. But there are obstacles. Mining projects take time. Permitting can take years. Infrastructure is expensive. Processing facilities require huge capital investments. Battery technologies can change. Commodity prices can collapse. And a mineral that looks strategically essential today might face weaker demand tomorrow. Canada also has to work with indigenous communities and respect environmental requirements. So announcements alone don't guarantee success. A mine has to actually be built. A refinery has to actually operate. A processing plant has to produce material at competitive cost. And customers have to keep buying. That is why projects like Motawani are so important. They represent the transition from strategy to physical infrastructure. And Canada is putting significant money behind that transition. In July 2026, Ottawa launched the Canada Critical Minerals Accelerator. Its first major agreement involves Teck Resources and the company's trail operations in British Columbia. The government says the initiative is designed to accelerate critical mineral projects and strengthen production of strategic materials. Reuters reported that the Canadian government could invest up to $400 million in the expansion, while Teck plans to invest up to $850 million. The facility is particularly important because it can process strategic metals such as germanium, antimony, and gallium. These materials are not simply battery ingredients. They are also important for semiconductors, defense systems, radar, and advanced technology. That tells us something. Canada's critical mineral strategy is bigger than the EV industry. Electric vehicles are one part of the story. National security is another. Advanced manufacturing is another. Energy storage is another. And that makes the stakes even higher. The United States, therefore, has a complicated relationship with Canada's strategy. On one hand, American manufacturers could benefit enormously from stronger Canadian mineral production. A larger supply of North American graphite, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other materials could help U.S. battery factories. On the other hand, Washington cannot simply assume that every Canadian mineral will automatically flow south. Canada now has Japanese buyers, Korean buyers, European partners, domestic processing, and potentially new customers across Asia. That creates competition, and competition changes bargaining power. So the provocative headline, "Canada redirected its battery metals to Japan," isn't quite accurate. But the underlying trend is real. Canada is redirecting something else. It is redirecting its strategy from dependence toward diversification, from raw exports toward processing, from one dominant customer toward multiple partners, and from ordinary commodity trade toward strategic supply chain relationships. Japan is an important part of that transformation, and Panasonic is one of the most visible corporate examples. Nouveau Monde Graphite is one of the most visible Canadian examples. Together they show how the new mineral economy is being constructed, not through one giant deal, but through layers of agreements, government support, private investment, offtake contracts, research partnerships, processing facilities, infrastructure, and strategic stockpiles. Piece by piece, a new network is emerging. And once that network is established, it could last for decades. That is why this matters for America. The United States still has enormous advantages. It has the world's largest economy, it has major automakers, it has enormous battery investment, it has defense demand, it has advanced technology, and it is now investing billions to rebuild mineral supply chains. But Washington will have to compete for Canadian resources rather than simply assuming access. That may be the most important change, because Canada's resources are becoming more valuable precisely because the world is becoming more uncertain, and uncertainty creates demand for reliable suppliers. Japan wants them, the United States wants them, South Korea wants them, Europe wants them, and Canada is positioning itself as one of those suppliers. The next phase of the electric vehicle race may therefore be fought far away from car dealerships. It will be fought in mines, refineries, ports, railways, battery material plants, recycling facilities, and government offices where long-term supply agreements are negotiated. Whoever controls those networks will have an advantage, and Canada is trying to make sure it has a seat at the table. So no, Canada hasn't simply slammed the door on America. In fact, the opposite may eventually happen. A stronger Canadian critical mineral industry could make North America more resilient. American factories could receive more Canadian battery materials. Japanese companies could provide investment and technology. Canadian companies could provide the minerals. South Korean and European manufacturers could become additional customers. And together, these relationships could create a supply chain less dependent on China. But there is one crucial difference from the old system. Canada wants choices, and those choices give Ottawa leverage. The age of assuming that Canadian resources will automatically flow south is giving way to an age of strategic competition. Japan sees Canada as a reliable resource partner. Canada sees Japan as a major source of investment, technology, and market diversification. The United States sees Canada as an essential part of its own mineral security. And China sees a growing coalition trying to reduce dependence on Chinese processing. That is the real battle, not Canada versus America, not Japan versus the United States, but competing visions for who will control the supply chains of the next industrial era, and the stakes are enormous. Because the batteries powering tomorrow's vehicles are only one part of the equation. The same minerals will help power grids, data centers, defense systems, electronics, robotics, and advanced manufacturing. Whoever secures those materials today could shape industrial power for decades. Canada has the resources. Japan has the industrial expertise. The United States has the manufacturing scale. South Korea has battery technology. Europe has enormous automotive demand, and China still holds tremendous processing power. The question is which countries can connect these pieces without becoming dependent on any single one of them. Canada's answer is becoming increasingly clear. Build more mines. Build more refineries. Build more processing capacity. Sign long-term agreements. Attract Japanese and other allied investment. Develop domestic infrastructure, and keep multiple markets open. That is why the Canada-Japan relationship deserves attention. It isn't simply about a shipment of graphite. It isn't simply about Panasonic. It isn't simply about electric vehicles. It is about the architecture of the global critical minerals economy. And that architecture is being built right now. One mine, one refinery, one contract, one investment, and one strategic partnership at a time. The United States isn't necessarily being pushed outside, but America is no longer the only destination Canada has to consider. And that may ultimately be the biggest story of all. Canada is not turning its back on North America. It is making sure North America is not its only option. Japan is helping make that possible. And as tariffs, export controls, geopolitical tensions, and competition over critical minerals continue to reshape global trade, those options could become one of Canada's most valuable economic assets. The mineral race has begun, and Canada wants to make sure it is not merely supplying the winners. It wants to be one of them.